Yeah, I think we're 2 minutes past the hour, so I guess we are ready to get started. So hi everyone and welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today. So our webinar today is defining the undefined. What is Tier 0 Part 3? And yeah, a few housekeeping items before we begin. We have a Q&A chat feature here in Zoom. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please use that for asking questions. And yeah, we'll try to answer them either like during the presentation or in the end where we have time for questions. The webinar is also being recorded. So yeah, you can use the same link as you used to join this webinar to actually watch the recording later. And it will also be put on YouTube after a couple of days. So if you like commercials, then yeah, you can watch it on YouTube. Cool. Let's see. Yeah, so for the agenda, first we're gonna do a quick recap of what we have already covered in the previous episodes of what is Tier 0. And then we are going to talk about today's scope, which is EntraID. Then I'm going to give a quick recap of the enterprise access model for those of you that have not understood it completely yet. Probably like most people are like struggling to understand it, but yeah, and that includes myself. But I'll try to explain the model briefly before we start to talk about like what we have as default Tier 0 nodes in BloodHound in Entra. Then Thomas, which we have here with us today, is going to talk about his Entra Ops project, which we are very excited to hear more about. And then at last, we're going to discuss a couple of EntraID roles and whether or not they belong to Tier 0. But first, who are we? Yeah, so here are the three panelists that we have on the webinar here today. And Thomas, will you give like a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Thomas Naunheim. I'm a cybersecurity architect at Knudsen and also Microsoft MVP for security, spending many years in designing and developing enterprise access model, or formerly known as the TING model in Active Directory and Azure. And as you already said, driving also a community project called Entra Ops, and I'm happy to share some insights about that as well.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, we are very happy to have you on this webinar here. Entra is definitely an interesting field that we need to know more about, and yeah, it's great to have you on this webinar here with us today. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry I had to step away for a second. So my name is Andy Robbins, and my house is not under immediate threat of catastrophic flooding. So I'm one of the co-creators of BloodHound. My job nowadays is I'm a principal product architect here at Spectre Ops, where I work closely with Jonas to kind of work on the future of BloodHound. And then Jonas, I'll pass that back over to you to introduce yourself, and then I can take back over for MC duties if you like.
Yeah, so my name is Jonas, and I work together with Andy in the product discovery team of Spectre Ops. So yeah, as Andy said, we're working on like the future of BloodHound, finding ways to incorporate new attack paths into BloodHound. And yeah, I've already gone through I think the housekeeping items about like how we have the Q&A where people can ask questions, and also told people that we record this webinar so people can watch it later through the same link. Anything else that we should cover before we get started?
No, that covers it. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so let's start with the recap. So in the first episode of this series here, we gave like a kind of a history lesson on like what is tier 0, and explained how back in 2012 Microsoft introduced this AD tier model, and recommended their users or customers to use this model to construct a layered architecture in their on-premise AD environment. So by splitting everything up logically, isolating tier 0 as being the most critical assets of Active Directory, to protect these assets from compromise of compromised users in the regular user land, and also on the regular server infrastructure in the AD organization or AD infrastructure. Then we also explain like what the purpose was of this series. And to recap that is that we want to help organizations understand like what assets we see as being part of tier 0. We often find that organizations struggle to figure out like which kind of groups in on-premise AD and roles in Azure they should actually classify as tier 0. So we wanted to start a series where we can actually discuss these things and figure out what should actually belong to tier 0 and why. We also made a definition of what is tier 0, because we cannot like define anything as tier 0 without defining what is tier 0. And I'm just going to read up this definition here. So the definition we came up was tier 0 is a set of assets in control of enterprise identities and their security dependencies. And by control, we mean a relationship that can contribute to compromising the controlled assets or impact its operability. A security dependency can be a component whose security impacts another component's security. So to come up with a simple example, that could be a domain admin user in on-premise AD. That user has the control of all the enterprise identities in on-premise AD. And a security dependency could be the laptop that this domain admin is working out of. So this laptop in itself is not an interesting item. It doesn't hold any interesting data about the organization. But if this laptop allows everyone to remote in as admin, that is a security problem, and that will become a security problem for the domain admin account. So in that way, it becomes a security dependency for tier 0, and then also an asset that belongs to tier 0. So in the first episode, we went through the Microsoft's original list of tier 0 AD groups, and decided whether or not we think they should belong to tier 0 or not. And then in the second episode, we walked through a few more on-premise AD objects to talk about those. And that's pretty much the recap of what we did. I'll send a link in the chat in a few minutes to the first episode, the blog post for that episode, which also includes links to the recording of that session and a link to the second blog post and the second recording. So today we are jumping up into the cloud and focusing on EntraID. And to talk about EntraID, we also want to really talk about this enterprise access model, which is the new tiering model that Microsoft introduced back in 2020, where they deprecated the old AD tier model and replaced it with this thing here that encompasses more than just on-premise AD. So let's begin with the data workload plane. That is where the organization has most of the business data and applications and data and workflows. So that is where the regular users access their applications and data that they use in their daily work. And you can see that in the bottom of the model here, you have the regular users with their user access. They have a user account and a user device. Then there might be some intermediaries that they have to go through. For example, if the organization have an application running in their infrastructure, the user might need to jump on a VPN in order to access that application, for example. Could also be that some applications require some kind of two-factor authentication. Then there's also app access, which is also in the bottom here. So like there could be API access. But then from above, we can see that there's also this privileged access. And privileged access to the data workload plane could be that, for example, you have admin access to a given application that is, could be quite important for the organization. Let's say that if it's an organization that trades shares, a trading company, then like if you have admin access and you can grant access to trading pools and stuff like that, then you might be considered as a privileged user in this application, and then you need privileged access in order to access this data workload plane. Then there's the management plane, which is where the infrastructure hosting the applications and the data and workloads in the data workload plane. So that could be, for example, a regular server in on-premise AD, or it could be Azure, for example, or any other cloud provider. So it's here where IT admins, they log in and manage these things from for the organization. At last, we have the control plane, where the organization controls all the enterprise identities and everything that gives like full control over the environment is controlled from here, basically. So the control plane is what we call tier 0 in on-prem, and what we will also refer to when we say tier 0 in this episode here. I think that covers everything for this model. Do you guys have anything to add? No,
I think that's I think in basic the idea behind the enterprise access model.
Cool.
Yeah,
I'm gonna toss it over to you, Andy.
Yeah. So now I'll talk about, in the BloodHound tool, what are the intra nodes that we automatically assign the tier 0 definition to, that not only do we automatically assign that definition, but we actually don't allow users to change that assignment either. So these are the nodes, principal types, roles, etc., that 100% of the time guaranteed will have a mechanical way to gain control of everything within the EntraID tenant. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that list that starts off with the Entra roles and also the Azure tenant. And Jonas, I think you'll have to click on there to go to the next slide. There we go. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
So the first and maybe most obvious, if you think about it, node that we automatically and permanently assign as tier 0 is the tenant object itself. And so Jonas talked earlier about the definition of tier 0, which is the set of assets that control enterprise identities and also their security dependencies. And so the tenant forms the authorization and authentication trust boundary around itself for the principles that reside within that tenant, the apps that are defined within that tenant by being app registrations, devices that are managed under that tenant, etc. And so while the tenant not only controls credentials and authentication for users that may be using those credentials, it is also the object that is manipulated whenever you are federating identity to some other external source. So for example, you may set up certificate-based authentication on a tenant where a trusted root CA is able to authenticate users. And so a certificate signed by that CA is trusted by the tenant to say, I trust that the CA has properly authenticated this user, and they can authenticate to the tenant without a credential that is known by the tenant. So the tenant itself is tier 0, period, end of story. and it always will be. Same thing as like a domain in Active Directory. The domain head object is analogous enough to the concept of a tenant, and a domain we also tag as tier 0. Then we get into the EntraID admin roles that always have either the immediate or the not immediate, but a mechanical way to escalate up to having full control of the tenant. So obviously the global administrator role is tier 0 because global admin has full control of everything. And anything that role doesn't grant access to, that role can give itself that access. So for example, the tenant is the trust boundary around itself, but also it establishes an authentication boundary around any subscriptions that trust the tenant as well. And so by default, a global admin isn't going to have control of anything in Azure Resource Manager, but they can toggle that and turn that on for themselves to give themselves full control of everything in Azure Resource Manager. And that's just the way it is. And that is Microsoft's design, and that's not going to change. Privileged role administrator can promote itself or any other principal to any role, including global administrator. Privileged authentication administrator can reset the credentials or otherwise control the passwordless authentication properties of any principal, including global administrators. And then there is a hidden role called partner tier 2 support. And we have a blog post written that explains exactly what that role is. The long and the short of it is that this role, called partner tier 2 support, allows promotion to any role the same way that privileged role admin does. So any principal that has partner tier 2 support can promote themselves or anybody else to global administrator. So we tag those roles as being tier 0. And then we also tag any principal that has a permanently assigned role for one of those roles as tier 0 as well. So let's go to the next slide. And this will round out what we automatically tag as tier 0 within Entra. And so EntraID admin roles are one authorization system that admins can use. But then another authorization system that admins can use that affects Entra are MS Graph app role assignments. Every Entra tenant has MS Graph. Every Entra tenant has the MS Graph service principal. And every Entra tenant can have service principals that have one of these two app role assignments. The first one is called role management.readwrite.directory, which allows promotion to any EntraID admin role, including global admin. And that can be for the service principal granting that to itself or to any other principal in the tenant. The second here is app role assignment.readwrite.all. And any service principal that has that app role can grant itself or any other service principal the top app role. So this is kind of similar to like privileged role admin, where a service principal that has app role assignment.readwrite.all can grant itself role management.readwrite.directory and then can promote itself to global admin. And critically, the app role assignment.readwrite.all app role bypasses the human consent process for making an app role assignment granted and configured. I hear the alarm going off again, so I need to listen to what the message is saying so I don't die. But that rounds out what I have to talk about in this moment. So Jonas, I'll pass it back over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Andy. And I think I will toss it over to you, Thomas. I think I probably need to give you access.
It's
Are
all
you
about
able
privilege
to?
permissions, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's
Maybe
see
if
if I'm
I stop
able to.
sharing,
Yes.
it's
So,
working.
okay, we can see my screen, right? Okay, perfect.
At least I can, so I hope people will
All
say
right.
if they can't.
Yeah, so let's talk about Entra Ops and what is the project behind the name. So I've started to initialize some community project. It started as a personal research project around figure out how to automate security tasks in Entra. And over the years, I collected some PowerShell scripts around implementing the tiering model. And my idea was to share also some of the parts for the community. And one of the key aspects of Entra Ops is the classification model. And I've decided to build a very granular classification model to identify control plane roles in EntraID. And everything starts with classify a privileged user or workload. So during the identity provisioning process, I will try to classify what will be the assume scenarios or use cases. In this case, we've got a user called ADM Tom0, and this is a user from the identity team, which has mostly control plane permissions. And on the left side, I've started to build a classification for each role definition action that exists in Microsoft Entra. Like in this case, I'm updating the password of users. And also very important, and we will have a particular look into that in a few seconds as well, is the role assignment scope. And in this case, I've decided to say, okay, if I have a role on the directory scope or on a particular administrative unit that includes updating passwords, then it is part of the user management in Azure AD or in EntraID. And so it is my interpretation that this should be a control plane task. And as soon I have a privileged user or privileged workload in EntraID, that has a role, like in this case, help desk administrator, regardless, it's netted by a group. In this case, it's a transitive assignment, or is it managed by PIM? If the role scope or the role action and the role action matches, so then the user permission gets also the classification as a control plane admin. As I said before, it is really important to consider the scope of an EntraID role. So by default, we have a really flat hierarchy in EntraID, which means everything starts that user groups are existing in a flat hierarchy. And I have some EntraID roles that mostly assigned on the directory scope. And as soon I'm using role assignable groups, or if I'm assigning permanent or legible roles to a user, those principles will be protected in EntraID particular. So that means Authenticator admin is not able to reset the credentials of those users. So there's a privileged authenticator admin needed. On the other side, we have something called cross-service or service-specific roles, which means we have roles that have permissions in other M365 airbags as well, like the Intune admin, which has full access to the Intune service. But on the other side, we have other RBAC systems like Azure or any third-party SaaS application. And that is, those are also using groups or users from Entra, but those objects are not particularly protected because Entra does not recognize or see them as a privileged object. So what should be or could be an option is to avoid granting directory scope permissions. So in this case, that a group administrator is not being able to modify a group that will be used in Azure RBAC, for example, to delegate permissions on a subscription that hosts a domain controller. So that will be option number one: avoid directory scope assignment, or consider what are the scope of the role, so that we don't have any lateral movement path to a security principal or group that exists in our RBAC systems. Another option has been introduced last year called restricted management AUs. In that case, I can assign a user or group to an RMAU, to a restricted management administrative unit. And as part of the assignment, all the inheritance from role assignments on the directory scope will be blocked. And only a particular assignment on the scope of the special administrative unit is allowed to modify the objects in this unit. So that is, I think, a great way to protect all the groups or users that are privileged outside of the Entra role or RBAC system. Let's have a quick look how Entra Ops classification can be used. So first of all, if we go here to the repository, you will find here, and I hope we can still see my screen. Is everything fine? Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Yep.
It's also about the virtual desktops. So in that case, we can see all the detailed classification based on the role definition actions. And this is a community project, so feel free to contribute if you have a different opinion or you like to have a suggestion for other classification. And it is also an option to have a different classification. So for example, if you're not following my idea that BitLocker keys to have full access on the keys for recovery keys, and that should be not tier 0 because you don't have any pores in your environment, and you can modify the tiering here with the JSON file. And as part of the classification, there are also some scripts that generates classification for every directory role. For example, if I go here to the global reader, we can see all the classification for each role actions, but also the classification on the directory role himself. In this case, it is control plane, because I have decided that BitLocker key recovery access is something high sensitive because of using pores. But that is some edge cases. So in case of doubts, I'm decided more to go ahead and classify them as control plane, but it really depends also on you. What is your sensitivity level for classifying tier 0? There's a couple of ways how you can use the JSON. I also put that here on my GitHub project. And there are some community tools around the classification as well. One nice code sample is from Martin Son, which has written a cipher to integrate the classification to BloodHound so that you can search for directory role members. Another one is written by Julian Howard. He has written HTML viewer to discover all the directory roles in EntraID. And there's also the integration of Entra Ops, so you can look for all the control plane roles. And if you have, for example, here application administrator, you can go to the details of the permissions and then also discover what are the control plane permissions within the role, and getting all the sensitive role actions that are included in the role definition. One of the main goals about Entra Ops that I like to release soon to the community is a solution about ingest the data to Microsoft Sentinel. In this case, I have a workbook, and I'm looking for management plane admins that has been classified in my environment, and if they are assigned to control plane permissions. In this case, I have a user called ADM mob1, and this user is a management plane user, but has assignment on control plane. Now, if I go down, I can see it is a custom role. So that is one of the benefits to classify on role actions. You also apply the classification to undefined roles. And in case you protected all your high privileged groups and users by using restricted management AUs or role assignable groups, or assigning them to EntraID roles, so they are protected. So maybe if you have something like a directory role that is able to modify security groups, then you can ask yourself, is it still a control plane? Because your assets are protected by some features in EntraID. And that's the reason why I introduce a way to scan your environment if all privileged objects are protected. And if that's the case, then, for example, the group administrator will classify as a management plane and not as a control plane, because it has no direct access to privileged users or groups in your environment. And the result is a full automated classified file. And you see also the scope in your environment, what includes privileged objects. And so the classification is fine granular created for your environment. Yeah, that's a quick look on Entra Ops, and really looking forward to have the release to the community about the advanced tooling.
That's great, Thomas. Thank you for sharing that. I think if we go back to Jonas's screen, Jonas will be able to take us back to the deck, or we can stay here. So we're going to talk, and we're going to kind of dive into kind of a more open conversation between the three of us and touch on a lot of what Thomas was saying. And then we also have the Q&A feature. So if you want to ask a question, please ask it in the Q&A. And to kind of start the conversation off, we're going to start with the basic set of roles in Entra that BloodHound today automatically tags as tier 0. And so you can see we've got 3 different columns here where we can place any Entra role into. On the very far left is not tier 0. So maybe I was about to say global reader, but based on what Thomas just showed us, maybe that's not so clear. But certainly, let's say directory reader, I would say is not tier 0. Then in the middle, we have it depends, which is kind of the classic consultant answer to everything. And then on the very far right, we have is tier 0, no argument, every single time, every environment, it is tier 0, and it should be protected as such. So in that column on the very far right, we have those 4 roles that we described earlier. And then if we go to the next slide, we have this other role called security administrator. And so the question is, which box does this go into? And I have my own thoughts about this, but Thomas, I think I kind of want to hear your thoughts first, because I think you have a pretty obviously like informed, but I think you also have a subtle take on this.
Yeah, so maybe using my JSON files or Julian tool would be my little helper to figure out what is included in the role. But if I remember right, I would expect definitely go for tier 0 when it comes to security administrator. And there's a couple of, I think, good reasons to classify them as tier 0, because this role has access to conditional access, and also to Defender for Endpoint. And if we were talking about the whole XDR stack, we have features like live response, which give us the opportunity to execute response tasks on servers, maybe also on-premise. and that ends in a compromise of Active Directory as well if it gets wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. So I think if we go to the next slide, we'll see that Thomas would place security administrator into the tier 0 box. And I think the reasoning that you give is totally valid for a lot of organizations. So if you're using Microsoft Defender, it has that live response feature where you can basically just execute shell commands as the system user on any system that is managed by Defender or has a Defender agent on it. And that, in my view, a lot of times is going to basically guarantee escalation up to domain admin if the host that you're executing commands on is joined to an on-prem Active Directory domain. But then certainly if you have that running on PAW, or if you have it running on a domain controller, then there's absolutely no question. It must be considered tier 0. And then the note that you shared about conditional access, I think that's valid as well, in that with this role assignment, a principal can degrade the security posture of another more highly privileged principal than itself. So to me, it's like a little bit of a gray area. I think it kind of depends, but it also, over time, as more organizations adopt these different tools from Microsoft, and where Defender becomes more common and hybrid joining devices to intra and on-prem becomes more common, then the security administrator role, in my mind, starts to drift from the it depends column more into the is tier 0 column. Jonas, what do you think about that?
I think I agree with what you said. I think for conditional access, I guess if you have control over conditional access, could you potentially also block tier 0 principals from logging into stuff? Because
Sure.
in that case, then I think it also belongs to tier 0 for that reason, because we have stated in our definition, if you can affect tier 0's ability to operate, then it should also belong to tier 0, because if you can prevent all tier 0 principles from logging in to anything, then you have caused quite a havoc. So I think that's another reason why it actually should belong to tier 0.
Yeah. I can imagine a pretty nefarious situation where an adversary may use this privilege to start executing arbitrary commands on devices through Defender, and then use conditional access to block access for everybody else except for themselves to every application in Entra. That would be pretty nefarious. Now, there are also roles in Entra where the name may be a little deceiving as far as how powerful this role actually is. And you really have to dig in, like Thomas has with Entra Ops, into the actions that are allowed by a particular role. Great example is this role here called Knowledge Administrator. And so, again, I have my thoughts about this, but Thomas, maybe you can describe for us, how you see this role and how you see, which column it should go into and why.
Yeah, so knowledge administrator, as you already said, is a really special one, because it looks really like, oh, that's like a management role or something like an information worker role, but it includes the permission to modify security groups. And if we think about most environments out there, security groups will be used, as shown in my Entra Ops demo, in relation to assign Azure RBAC roles or third-party cloud environments like AWS. And so if you have high-privileged security groups and that are not particularly protected, like I said before, with role assignable groups or restricted management AUs, for me, it would be tier 0. because knowledge administrator could modify the security groups to gain privileges in Azure RBAC. But at the end, it depends, because if you have a really very strict approach to protect those objects, then it would be also fine to use it as a not tier 0. So for me, it will end in it depends.
Yeah, I totally agree. I imagine, somebody could have a domain controller running as a virtual machine or through Azure Arc, where a non-role eligible security group may have the contributor role or the owner role assigned to that particular VM or Arc agent, or to resource group, subscription, whatever, in the hierarchy above that. But even though it is a non-role assignable group, as we know, that doesn't apply necessarily to Azure RBAC. It only applies to EntraID role assignability. And so this knowledge administrator role can become more powerful than it ever should have been, because that role would allow manipulation of that non-role eligible security group, which then would allow for compromise of a inarguably tier 0 asset. So I think we probably have an animation that will move that into the it depends column. And we had a question in the Q&A about a role called Intune administrator. And Jonas, maybe you can kind of answer that question live and kind of talk through this role.
Yeah. So I think, Intune administrator, I think we had a discussion about it because, so it's most likely going to be a tier 0 in most organizations, because your global admins will also need a computer they can log into administrate Entra from. And that device is likely going to be a device that's controlled from Entra. So if Intune admins can control that device, then it kind of becomes because it's a security dependency for the global admins, then it also becomes tier 0. And if Intune admins can execute codes on these devices because they are controlled from Entra, then Intune admins also becomes tier 0.
I think one thing that I would add is that outside of the concept of administrative units, the mechanics that we're talking about here, most of them cannot be controlled by Entra admins. So, the fact that global admin can give itself full control of everything in Azure RBAC, that's something that an Entra admin or an Azure admin can't control. And so that's why we feel pretty confident making these very concrete statements about, if you have this role, you can do this, because the access model is different than it is in on-prem Active Directory. It's not nearly as atomic as it is in on-prem Active Directory. It's very much more of a one-to-many relationship with a principal that's been assigned to one of these roles, that they have, for the most part, kind of an all or nothing scope of objects that they gain control of. So we have another role.
Yeah, I think before we move on to that one, I guess for Intune admins, I guess you could also protect the tier 0 devices in the same manner with the AU restrictions. Is that correct, Thomas?
I think the main issue regarding the Intune administrator is the fact, of course, we have also some delegation models in Intune with scope and tags. But what I have seen so far, it is not possible to have a delegation to the scope and tag and avoid assignments on the Intune tenant. So you still have to struggle to have the split between the scope and tags. So that makes it really hard to separate a PAR from the enterprise devices in Intune. But when it comes to the Entra objects, then of course we can create also restricted management AUs for devices, and for all the device configuration, groups related to that. But maybe having two additions to the Intune admin role, because as I already said, with Global Reader, you should also ask yourself, what are other keys or credentials that can be requested as part of a role membership? And in this case, the Intune admin has the option, if the lab solution is in place, to get the local credentials from labs. So that gives you local admin permissions directly on the physical level. And my hard decision regarding the Global Reader to get the BitLocker keys is another aspect. So if I have full access as a local admin and also the option to disable or recover the BitLocker state, that are, I think, also interesting points when it comes to the PAW security.
Yeah, it feels like with admins starting from 0 with Entra and then adding this service and adding that service and adding this capability and adding that and that and that, the web of privileges becomes more complex than what can be reasonably managed. And because of that, I feel that it would be reasonable to expect that in the future, we would see a similar model from Microsoft come out, similar to Red Forest, where you have a red tenant, if you will, that is your tier 0 tenant. And every principal in that, every role in that, everything in that is considered tier 0. And then you would have possibly different production tenants where these role assignments are used extremely sparingly, but with the understanding that Global Reader becomes tier 0, security administrator becomes tier 0. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw guidance from Microsoft come out to that effect over the next couple of years.
Yeah, especially in environments that have more than one tenant. Of course, Microsoft is recommended to have just one tenant, but when we take on regulatory compliance requirements, you should have a staging tenant. Maybe you have B2C tenants for your customer identities. So I think there's some valid reasons to have more than one tenant. And the big question is if you like to establish a privilege EAM for each tenant or try to centralize them to admin tenant, call it whatever you like, some special hearted environment.
Yeah. Maybe a good time to move on to the next role that we have in this example. And so the next role that we're talking about is the application administrator role. And so Jonas, Thomas, with your permission, I'll kind of give this a shot myself first and then get your input. So for me, I don't know exactly where this is going to animate into, but for me, it depends. The application administrator role allows any principal with that role to add credentials to every app registration in the tenant and also every service principal in the tenant. So you can add credentials and you can also add arbitrary owners to each of those classes of objects as well. Now, I tried for a long time to mechanically turn that into global admin. For example, if we have the application administrator role, we have the ability to manipulate the MS Graph service principal. And if we can manipulate the MS Graph service principal, maybe we can get to a point where we could create a user and then we could have an app role assignment assigned to the user instead of a service principal. Couldn't get it to work, long story short. So I couldn't find a way to turn a greenfield intra tenant taking application admin and turning that into global admin. I couldn't find it. Having said that, I think that one of the most common configurations that an intra admin will eventually have is an app registration or a service principal that has some elevated privileges in the tenant, including possibly role management.readwrite.directory and or app role assignment.readwrite.all. If that happens, which it often does, then the application admin role, if it is scoped to the entire tenant, that enables manipulation of every service principal, and that enables guaranteed escalation up to global admin. all things being equal. So for me, it depends. But Thomas, Jonas, I want to see if one of y'all have anything to add to that or anything to correct.
I would say because of two facts. So fact number one, we have no restricted management use for applications and service principal objects. And fact number two, there's no protection for service principal with role assignments, similar to what we have for users. I would go more the way to consider the role as tier 0, because I think it will be hard for many organizations to identify if we have high privileged cloud applications, and they should be particularly protected because there's no native protection in Entra. And this role also allows to add credentials to service principals, so to multi-tenant apps. Of course, Microsoft is protecting first-party apps, but as you already said, maybe there will be a vulnerability in the future. Nobody knows.
Yep.
But so I would say it makes more sense to have a hard cut and say, okay, it's tier 0. Just use the application admin role on object level. And I think that is the better option. And there's another aspect when it comes to application admin, because a member of this role has a privileged in admin consent. So as part of the application admin, you have a different consent policy, and that makes the role, in my opinion, also sensitive.
Yeah. I feel as an Entra admin, the complexities and the evolution of all of these different configurations and the consequences of those configurations over time is frankly infuriating and confusing. And so I see a question in the Q&A from, I think this name is pronounced Matthias, but correct me if I'm wrong there, please. It says, is it useful to create a separate tenant for administrators, or would the permissions required to manage the main tenant still cause trouble? Honestly, I really think that the future probably is having a separate tier 0 tenant where these roles can be doled out safely, given the opacity of the impact of these role assignments, and more importantly, given Microsoft's predilection to change these systems, sometimes announced, sometimes not announced. So I see it being worth the effort to have a distinct tier 0 tenant that is trusted and only accessible by your tier 0 users. So, Jonas, if you have anything to add, please do so, or we can see where this animates into.
Yeah, I guess yeah, I think your arguments, Thomas, are really good, and perhaps I think I agree that if in doubt, you should probably just classify this one as tier 0. But you can kind of see on the slides already, like that will probably not go into the is tier 0 box. I should probably have chosen another order of going through these roles, because it can't fit in there. So it ended up in it depends. So I guess the only reason I see why it should be it depends is, I guess, in a completely vanilla EntraID, then I guess if it's not possible to gain full control, then I guess you can say that it should not belong to tier 0 in that case. But yeah, I completely agree that if in doubt, you should definitely add it to your tier 0, or consider it as tier 0, and treat any principal in that having that role as tier 0 principals.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Given the time we have left, why don't we go to the next slide, Jonas, where you can walk us through that table, and then anybody who's watching, please do feel free to continue asking questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will answer as many of them as we can in the time we have left.
Yeah. So I quickly also wanted to mention that we will add these roles that we walked through today to the tier 0 table. that is where we have added all the on-premise AD principles and assets that we've gone through in the first 2 episodes, and whether or not they belong to tier 0. So that will include like a description of them and a reasoning for why we have considered them as tier 0 or not. We haven't had any before that we have put this like it depends kind of label on. I kind of hated that we had to do that with Entra, but it felt necessary because of the nature of Entra, how like you can add something and then as a consequence of adding some functionality, somebody else will suddenly have an attack path to gain full control over the environment. I feel that's not always the same in on-premise AD. It's more about like actually making an active decision of making something you shouldn't have done. But check out the tier 0 table, and please come with all the suggestions you have and pull requests. We want this to be a living thing that we can update when new research come out, and that people can use to figure out like what assets belong to tier 0.
Yeah. So the time we have left, just a quick housekeeping note. This webinar was recorded. You can view it at the same link that you used to register for the webinar. And we'll also be sending out a follow-up email with helpful links and other information that we talked about in this presentation. We do have some questions in here, and Thomas, I wonder if maybe I can put this first question on to you, because I think you've probably got the best perspective as far as the atomic permissions exposed by not only the built-in roles, but that can be assigned to custom roles. And so the question from Jonathan is, what about custom roles? Are some permissions in them, are some of those permissions such that they should be considered as tier 0?
Yeah, definitely. So even Microsoft has introduced is privilege flag. I think we can all be a different opinion or share the opinion about each role actions, but even in this classification, there's a couple of role actions that are available for custom roles that are privileged from the perspective from Microsoft, and that's also my opinion. So as we already discussed, modify groups is something, it depends, right? But it is part of a custom role selection. And there's also some other role actions like revoke the refresh tokens, for example, that can be also have a huge security impact. So that's the reason why I also decided to do my classification on role action, and feel free to have a look on the role action classification that I made, and if your custom role is covered there as well.
Yeah. So here's another good question. So this question says, would both Cloud App Admin and App Admin not classify as tier 0 because of their ability to grant consent from foreign applications that are published in other tenants? This is a great question. So I'll take a stab at this first. I think that because of the likelihood of a service principal or an app registration having a tier 0 privilege, I think often Cloud App Admin and App Admin should be considered tier 0 because they would gain control of those other principals that have tier 0 rights. When it comes to being able to grant consent to foreign applications, that's where, in my opinion, it gets a little muddy, because the ability for a Cloud App Admin or an App Admin to grant consent is, I believe it is, higher than a typical user that doesn't have any admin role assignment. But I don't think, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that Cloud App Admin or App Admin is enough to grant consent for the most dangerous MS Graph app roles. So while a Cloud App Admin may be able to consent to a foreign application that is requesting role management.readwrite.directory, that role assignment, that app role assignment, is going to go into the configured but not granted state. And until it is granted by a global admin or a privileged role admin, I think those are the only two roles that can do that, I think, then the permission is not actually usable. Also, app role assignment.readwrite.all can bypass that consent process. There's an answer from a guest here named Eric that says Cloud App Admin and App Admin cannot grant consent on graph application permissions without global admin.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for confirming that, Eric. And Thomas, Jonas, anything that you would add to that or correct there?
Yeah, so absolutely right, Andy, what you explain. And nevertheless, I would strongly recommend to have a check on the consent policies, because the consent policies, the whole framework behind it, can also be manipulated. And you can build own policy definitions. And therefore, I strongly recommend to have a regular export review on that one. Because, as I said before, there are some special conditions for those roles, and you really like to know what are the consent that the cloud application admin can give. And I think that is some filtering for internal applications and some exposed app roles by own host app registration. I guess that was something what is possible, but as you already said and confirmed by Eric, it is not regarding high sensitive delegated permissions on the Microsoft Graph app roles.
Cool. Thanks for adding that, Thomas. And so we have one last question that we'll answer, and then we will wrap up. And so the question here says, would it be good advice to say never give applications or service principals more permissions than the custom owners of those objects have? And then the question goes on, it says, if an app or service principal is required to run more privileged, it should only be accessible to tier 0 users. So I think I see two questions in there. So one is, if a application or a service principal has custom owners, is it a good idea to not give that application or service principal higher privilege than those owners? And I would say yes. So by default, the owner of an app or a service principal can add an arbitrary secret to that object and then authenticate as the service principal or the service principal associated with the app registration. So you can add a credential to either object and then authenticate as the service principal. So I would say yes, it is a good idea to not give those owners ownership of a object that is higher privileged, or just avoid creating that scenario. And then the other question is, if you do have, the way I interpret this question is, if you do have a service principal that has tier 0 privileges, should it only be accessible by tier 0 users? Certainly, it should only be controllable by tier 0 users. So only the tier 0 users should have an intra role assignment that grants control of that service principal. And only tier 0 users should be added as an owner. And only tier 0 service principals should have the MS Graph app roles that allow for adding credentials or otherwise manipulating that service principal, for example. But if you're talking about access as in accessing the actual, business logic web application that authenticates as that service principal, then it gets a little muddier, I think. It gets a little messier because, for example, Okta has a service that will let you manage IAM outside of Entra, and it will let you promote yourself to global admin or request that through an Okta application. And then behind the scenes, Okta uses a service principal that has role management.readwrite.directory to actually promote you to global admin or whatever role you're requesting promotion to. So that access, where you're accessing that web application, Certainly, you're not going to be able to restrict that to only tier 0 users because they're not always going to have tier 0 rights. But certainly, access to that application should only be granted to individuals who have a justified need to request or approve role assignments. And those should be temporary and everything else that comes along with the privileged access management solution best practice. So that'll be the last question that we take. Actually, I lied because there's another good question from Jonathan. Jonathan says, are there any plans of adding other identity providers such as Okta into BloodHound Enterprise? Yes, we would like to do that. We don't know exactly when that will happen, but we are working on expanding the scope of BHE to include other identity providers, because certainly it matters, and these attack paths can emerge out of the connections between these different platforms. We would also like to add in AWS and other things as well. So before we drop, Thomas, I want to thank you for being our guest on this webinar, and I also want to let you have the last word and wrap us up.
So thank you for having me again, and it's really a great pleasure to be guest in this webcast. My final words: take care on your tier 0. I think we have giving some attention on roles, and ask yourself who is knowledge administrator and all our crazy named roles. And yeah, would be great to see you again.
Okay. We will wrap up there. Thank you for spending some time with us. Thanks for all the great questions. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and a great rest of your week.